My beloved child, something changed in a conversation your soulmate never expected to have. It did not begin with an argument, a dramatic confession, or some obvious moment that announced itself as important. It began quietly, almost casually, with one small detail that did not fit the story they had been told about you. At first, your soulmate nearly ignored it. They had heard so many opinions, so many carefully placed suggestions, so many little comments designed to make them question what they already felt. But this time, something inside them paused. Because when the third party repeated the same version of events they had repeated before, one piece suddenly contradicted another. And once your soulmate noticed that contradiction, they could not unsee it. Don't skip, because what followed was not simply someone being exposed. It was your soulmate beginning to understand how much of their uncertainty had been built from someone else's interpretation rather than their own experience with you. And that realization landed differently than anyone expected. There was a strange stillness around them afterward. Your soulmate did not immediately confront anyone. They did not announce what they had discovered. Instead, they became observant. They began remembering conversations that once seemed harmless. A question asked at the wrong moment. A suggestion disguised as concern. A story about you that always seemed to arrive exactly when they were feeling closest to you. None of those moments had appeared significant on their own. But when your soulmate placed them side by side, a pattern started forming. And here is where something deeply personal began to happen. Instead of focusing only on what the third party had done, your soulmate started thinking about you. About the times you remained calm when you could have defended yourself more loudly. About moments when you seemed to understand something was happening behind the scenes but refused to turn the connection into a competition. About the way you may have stepped back rather than forcing yourself to be believed. Suddenly, qualities that had once confused them began making sense. Your silence no longer looked like distance. Your patience no longer looked like uncertainty. And the more they reconsidered those memories, the more one uncomfortable question grew inside them. What if I judged something real through information that was never completely fair? Then came the detail nobody had planned for. Someone mentioned something the third party had apparently said earlier, and it was slightly different from what your soulmate had been told. Nothing dramatic. Just different enough. A date did not match. A reason had changed. The intention behind one conversation suddenly sounded less innocent. Your soulmate did not react immediately, but their mind became very quiet. You know that feeling when one missing piece enters a puzzle and suddenly you understand why the rest never sat correctly? That was the shift. They began going backward through everything, not with anger, but with clarity. And clarity can be powerful because it does not need noise. It simply asks better questions. Why was your name brought up so often? Why did certain doubts appear only after particular conversations? Why was the third party always prepared with another explanation whenever your soulmate started trusting what they personally felt? And perhaps the most revealing question of all, why did your soulmate feel more confused after speaking to that person, yet somehow calmer whenever they listened to their own heart? Something important is waiting for you in this realization, because your soulmate's attention slowly moved away from the third party and returned to the connection itself. They remembered a message from you differently. A look. A moment of kindness. Something you once said that they may have misunderstood because another voice had already influenced the meaning before they had time to feel it for themselves. And this time, your soulmate allowed the memory to stand alone. No commentary. No outside explanation. Just you, exactly as you were in that moment. That was when something softened. They realized that much of what they had personally experienced with you did not match the picture they had been encouraged to believe. Your actions had often been quieter than the rumors surrounding them. Your intentions had felt warmer than the warnings attached to them. And your presence, even when complicated by circumstances, had carried a consistency they were only now beginning to appreciate. But the deepest part was still ahead. Because being shown the truth about another person is one thing. Being shown the truth about your own choices is something else entirely. Your soulmate began wondering why they had allowed another voice to become so influential. Maybe they were trying to protect themselves. Maybe uncertainty made outside opinions feel safer than trusting something emotionally important. Maybe they were afraid of making the wrong decision, so they kept collecting advice until their own instincts became difficult to hear. And suddenly, this situation was no longer simply about blame. It became a moment of growth. Your soulmate could see that the third party had played a role, yes, but they could also see the moment where they had surrendered too much authority over their own feelings. That recognition mattered, because instead of turning them bitter, it made them more careful about what they would believe from now on. Then your name came up again. Not from the third party this time. Someone else said it naturally, without knowing everything that had been unfolding. Your soulmate became unusually quiet. The person speaking may not even have noticed. But inside your soulmate, another memory opened. They remembered something you had done without asking for recognition. Something simple. Perhaps you showed understanding when they were overwhelmed. Perhaps you respected a boundary even though it hurt. Perhaps you remained sincere when it would have been easier to become cold. Whatever the moment was, it suddenly carried more weight than it did when it happened. Because now your soulmate could compare something real with something they had merely been told. And reality was beginning to win. Stay till the end, because the third party's exposure was not the biggest change. The biggest change was your soulmate beginning to trust their own perception again. They started separating facts from assumptions. They stopped treating every opinion as evidence. They noticed how differently they felt when they thought about you without anyone else standing in the middle. There was less tension. Less mental noise. And beneath all of it, there was something they had tried not to name for a long time. They still cared about what was true between you. Not the version other people described. Not the version created from misunderstandings. The actual connection. The one made of conversations, choices, memories, and feelings only the two of you could fully understand. And then came a moment that caught even your soulmate off guard. The third party tried to explain themselves. It was not a grand confession. In fact, that was what made it revealing. Their explanation changed slightly depending on the question. One moment they claimed they were only trying to help. The next, they suggested they had misunderstood something. Then another detail shifted. Your soulmate listened more than they spoke. And with every small inconsistency, something inside them became steadier. They did not need to win the conversation anymore. They did not need to force an admission. They had already seen enough to understand that the version of you they had been given could no longer be accepted without question. What happened afterward was surprisingly gentle. Your soulmate stepped away from the conversation and spent time alone. No dramatic decision was made in that exact second. But something had clearly ended, the automatic trust they once placed in someone else's interpretation of you. In its place came curiosity. Real curiosity. What did you actually mean when you said that? What were you feeling during that distant moment? Had you been protecting your peace while they assumed you were pulling away? Had you known there was interference and simply decided not to fight for attention? Questions they once avoided were now becoming questions they wanted answered. And perhaps this is the part that would surprise you most. Your soulmate did not feel foolish for still caring. They felt almost relieved. Because for a while, they may have believed that caring about you meant ignoring logic. Now they were discovering something different. Perhaps logic had never been against the connection. Perhaps they had simply been working with incomplete information. That distinction changed the emotional atmosphere entirely. Suddenly, thinking of you did not feel like returning to an old confusion. It felt like reopening something that had never received a completely fair chance to speak for itself. A quiet truth was beginning to settle over everything. Your soulmate could no longer judge you based on what another person needed them to believe. They wanted their next understanding of you to come from you. Your words. Your behavior. Your actual presence. And that might sound simple, but emotionally, it represented a major shift. Because when someone stops asking, "What are people saying about this connection?" and starts asking, "What have I personally experienced here?" everything becomes clearer. Still, one piece remained unresolved. There was one conversation your soulmate kept remembering, one moment involving the third party that suddenly seemed more significant than all the others. At the time, nothing about it seemed unusual. But now, knowing what they know, your soulmate realizes there was a sentence spoken that night that may reveal exactly when the interference began and why your connection became the subject of so much attention in the first place. They have started looking at that moment differently, and the truth hidden inside it is bringing them toward a realization about you they were never prepared to make this soon. The third party may have been exposed, but what your soulmate is about to understand about their own feelings is where everything truly begins to change. What your soulmate remembered next was so ordinary that, at first, they almost dismissed it again. It was a conversation from some time ago, one of those moments that had seemed too small to matter. The third party had mentioned you almost casually, but there had been a strange precision in the way they spoke, as though they already knew exactly which uncertainty inside your soulmate to touch. Back then, your soulmate did not question it. Now they do. Because suddenly they can see something they could not see before. The conversation had not begun because your soulmate brought you up. The third party had brought you into it first. That realization changed the entire memory. Your soulmate sat with it quietly, replaying the wording, the pauses, even the timing. Why had your name appeared at that exact moment? Why had the conversation turned toward your intentions when nothing had happened between you that required an explanation? And why did the third party seem so certain about feelings that only you could truly know? Don't skip, because this was where your soulmate stopped looking at isolated moments and began seeing how one small suggestion had influenced the next. The first doubt had not arrived loudly. It had arrived disguised as a question. Are you sure you understand them? Then another question later. Then an interpretation. Then a little warning framed as concern. Nothing strong enough to sound unfair on its own, yet together they had gradually changed the way your soulmate viewed situations that once felt completely natural. And now, with distance, they could finally see how that happened. The strange part was that your soulmate did not feel the reaction they expected. They were not consumed by frustration. Instead, they felt a deep sadness for the version of themselves that had become so afraid of misunderstanding you that they listened to everyone except the person standing at the center of the story. That realization softened them. They began wondering how many times you had sensed the change in their energy without knowing exactly where it came from. How many times had you noticed them becoming quieter after seeming close? How many times had you tried to understand their distance while they were privately sorting through ideas about you that you had never even heard? And then another memory returned. You had once responded to their uncertainty in a way that seemed almost too calm. You did not chase. You did not demand an explanation. You did not try to prove yourself through dramatic words. At the time, your soulmate may have mistaken that calmness for detachment. Now they saw another possibility. Perhaps you understood that genuine connection cannot survive if one person must constantly defend themselves against invisible accusations. Perhaps your quietness was not indifference at all. Perhaps it was dignity. That thought stayed with them longer than they expected. Something important is waiting for you here, because this was the moment your soulmate began changing the question completely. They were no longer asking whether everything the third party said was wrong. They were asking something far more meaningful. Why did I believe an outside interpretation more quickly than I trusted what this person consistently showed me? And that question had no easy answer. Your soulmate remembered the times you were patient. The moments you listened carefully. The way you sometimes seemed to know when they needed space without making them feel abandoned. They remembered little details no outsider could explain because those moments belonged only to the two of you. And suddenly those quiet experiences became stronger evidence than every complicated story around them. Then something unexpected happened. Your soulmate looked back through an old message, not searching for anything dramatic, simply trying to understand the timeline. There was a sentence from you they had once read in a completely different way. At the time, because of everything they had been hearing, they assumed there was distance behind your words. But reading it now, without the third party's interpretation sitting in their mind, the sentence sounded almost painfully sincere. It was simple. Gentle. Perhaps even vulnerable in a way they had completely missed. Your soulmate read it twice. Then again. And for the first time, they wondered whether you had been trying to reach them emotionally while they were too distracted by suspicion to recognize it. That realization created a silence around them that felt heavier than any argument could have. Because discovering that another person influenced you is one thing. Discovering that the influence may have caused you to misunderstand someone who was genuinely trying to communicate with you is something entirely different. Your soulmate began recognizing places where they might have answered defensively when you had not attacked them at all. Moments where they withdrew because they were protecting themselves from an intention you may never have had. Suddenly the past looked less like a series of confusing events and more like two people trying to understand each other while too many interpretations stood between them. Yet something beautiful began growing inside that recognition. Your soulmate did not conclude that everything could magically be erased. They understood that trust deserves patience. They understood that clarity requires honest conversation, not imagined conclusions. But for the first time in a long while, they felt willing to understand rather than assume. That difference mattered. Stay till the end, because the next discovery was even more personal. Someone close to your soulmate mentioned that they had noticed a change whenever your name was brought up around the third party. Not jealousy, not anything dramatic, simply an unusual tension. Your soulmate initially said nothing. But inside, another piece clicked into place. They remembered how conversations about you would sometimes become strangely complicated even when your own actions had been simple. A normal message became something to analyze. A delayed response became something to question. A kind gesture was given another meaning. The connection had been examined so constantly that your soulmate had eventually forgotten what it felt like simply to experience it. That realization almost made them smile, because suddenly the solution seemed much simpler than the confusion. Stop letting other people narrate something they were never living. And from there, your soulmate did something they had not done for a long time. They remembered you without trying to decide anything. They allowed one memory to appear after another without judging them. A conversation that made them laugh. A moment when you surprised them with your understanding. A time they felt unusually comfortable around you. A small detail about you they had never forgotten despite everything. And slowly, something became undeniable, not as some dramatic destiny, but as an honest emotional fact. Their connection with you had mattered more deeply than they had allowed themselves to admit. The third party had not created that feeling, and therefore the third party could not truly erase it. They could only create noise around it. Once the noise began fading, the feeling underneath became easier to recognize. Then came the thought your soulmate had been avoiding: what does this person think of me now? That question affected them because until this point, most of their reflection had focused on what they had misunderstood about you. Now they began considering what their behavior may have communicated to you. Did you believe they stopped caring? Did you think they chose someone else's opinion over knowing you? Did their silence make you feel forgotten? Your soulmate could not answer those questions for you, and for once, they did not try. They simply accepted that you have your own experience of everything that happened. That acceptance marked another change. Instead of imagining they already knew your feelings, they began wanting to hear them directly. And this is where the story shifted from exposure toward possibility. The third party's influence was becoming less important than the choice your soulmate was starting to make within themselves. They wanted to become someone who asks rather than assumes. Someone who listens before interpreting. Someone who protects meaningful connections from unnecessary outside noise without isolating themselves from reasonable advice. There was maturity forming inside this situation, and perhaps that was the most unexpected outcome of all. But one final detail kept bothering them. The third party had once repeated something supposedly said by you, something your soulmate had quietly carried for a long time. It had influenced one of their biggest decisions about the connection. Now, after everything else had been questioned, your soulmates suddenly realized they had never actually heard those words from you. Not once. They had accepted them secondhand. And when they carefully traced where that statement came from, the story became strangely unclear. One person remembered it differently. Another could not confirm it. The third party's explanation became vague. Your soulmate felt their hearts sink not because they immediately knew the statement was false, but because they realized something that should have been verified between the two of you had instead been treated as fact without ever reaching you. And in that moment, your soulmate made a quiet promise to themselves: if they ever had the opportunity to understand this connection again, they would not begin with accusations. They would begin with a question. A real question. The kind that leaves room for your truth. The kind that says, "I heard something once, and I should have asked you instead of assuming." That sentence has not necessarily been spoken yet, but it is forming inside them. And what your soulmate discovers when they finally look more closely at that old statement may reveal why the third party became involved in the first place, because there is one missing piece connecting that rumor, your soulmate's sudden distance, and a decision made behind the scenes that you may never have known about. The missing piece did not arrive through confrontation. It arrived through one sentence your soulmate had heard before but never truly examined. Someone casually referred to the moment when the third party first began speaking about you, and suddenly the timeline no longer made sense. Your soulmate had always believed the interference started because something had happened between you. But now they were beginning to see that the interference may have started earlier, before the misunderstanding, before the distance, before the decision that changed everything. That detail mattered because it suggested something your soulmate had never considered. Perhaps the third party had already formed an opinion about your connection long before there was any real problem to solve. And once your soulmate noticed that possibility, they began revisiting the old statement that had affected them so deeply. It was supposedly something you had said about the future, something that made them believe you were uncertain about them. For a long time, they carried those words as if they had heard them directly from your mouth. They had reacted to them, protected themselves because of them, even changed how openly they showed their feelings because of them. Yet now, sitting quietly with the memory, they realized something almost startling in its simplicity. They could not remember your voice saying those words. They could only remember being told that you had said them. Don't skip, because the distinction between those two things was about to become the center of everything. Your soulmate started reconstructing the moment carefully. Where were they when they first heard it? Who brought it up? What had actually happened between you immediately beforehand? The more they thought, the stranger the sequence became. Things between you had not been falling apart at that time. In fact, there had been warmth. There had been a sense of growing closeness. There had even been one particular moment when your soulmate felt that something between you was becoming more honest, more emotionally real. And then, almost immediately afterward, the third party appeared with information that suggested the exact opposite. Your soulmate had never questioned the timing because the third party seemed concerned, believable, even protective. But now that concern looked different. Not necessarily cruel. Not necessarily calculated in every detail. But perhaps influenced by motives your soulmate had not understood. Maybe the third party feared losing their place in your soulmate's life. Maybe they thought they knew what was best. Maybe they misunderstood you and allowed that misunderstanding to grow into certainty. Whatever the reason, your soulmate was beginning to understand that confidence does not always equal truth. Someone can sound completely certain and still be wrong. That realization released something inside them. For months, perhaps longer, your soulmate had treated their doubt about you like a fact. Now it became what it always should have been, a question waiting for an honest answer. And questions feel different from conclusions. Conclusions close doors. Questions open them. Something important is waiting for you in that difference, because your soulmate began remembering how they behaved after hearing that statement. They became slightly less expressive. They waited for you to prove something you did not know needed proving. They watched your behavior through a lens you had never been told existed. When you gave them space, they wondered whether the rumor was true. When you were warm, they wondered whether you were simply being kind. When you hesitated, they treated that hesitation as confirmation. And slowly, without either of you intending it, a false question began shaping real behavior. That may be the saddest part of misunderstandings. Once someone expects distance, they can begin interpreting everything as evidence of distance. Your soulmate sees that now. And instead of defending their old perspective, they are finally willing to admit that they may have misunderstood you. That willingness changed their emotional posture completely. They stopped asking, "Why didn't you prove them wrong?" and started asking, "How could you have defended yourself against something nobody told you?" That question stayed with them. Because perhaps you had been standing in a situation where expectations around you had changed, but no one explained why. Perhaps your soulmate became cautious and you assumed they needed time. Perhaps they began withholding vulnerability and you respected their space. Perhaps both of you were responding to each other's reactions while the original misunderstanding remained hidden in the background. And when your soulmate saw the situation that way, they felt something deeper than regret. They felt compassion for you, but also for themselves. Neither of you had been given the clarity you needed. The third party's words may have created confusion, but the silence afterward allowed that confusion to become larger than it ever deserved to be. Then your soulmate remembered another detail. There had been a moment when you asked them a simple question, something like whether everything was okay between you. At the time, they answered carefully. Maybe they said they were fine. Maybe they changed the subject. Maybe they gave you a softer version of what they were actually thinking because they did not want to sound suspicious. Now that memory carried a completely different weight. You had given them an opening. You had sensed the shift. And they had chosen silence because they were still trying to decide whether what they heard was true. That realization hurt gently, not because the moment could not be understood, but because your soulmate suddenly saw how close clarity had once been. One honest conversation might have changed everything. Stay till the end, because this is where the third party's exposure stopped being merely about what they said and became about what your soulmate now intends to do differently. They no longer want second-hand certainty. They want first-person truth. They want to understand what you actually felt, what you actually meant, what you actually hoped for during the moments they were busy interpreting you from a distance. And there is something incredibly grounding about that shift. Your soulmate is not creating a fantasy about you. They are not deciding you were perfect. They are simply becoming willing to meet you as a real person again instead of meeting an idea built from other people's opinions. That may sound subtle, but emotionally it is enormous. Because real connection cannot survive when one person becomes a character in someone else's story. It survives when two people are allowed to speak for themselves. And your soulmate is finally beginning to understand that. Then another person quietly confirmed something unexpected. They remembered being present around the time the third party supposedly heard those words from you, and their memory did not match the story. They did not claim the third party had invented everything. They simply said the conversation had been different, more nuanced, less final. Perhaps you had expressed uncertainty about timing, not uncertainty about the person. Perhaps you had said you needed patience, but the message became, they do not want this. Perhaps you had been talking about circumstances, and someone transformed it into a statement about your feelings. Suddenly your soulmate saw how easily meaning can change when words travel through another person. One sentence loses context. Another person adds interpretation. By the time it reaches someone emotionally invested, it no longer sounds like the original message. Your soulmate became very still when they understood this. Because the old statement that had influenced their biggest decision may not have been entirely false, it may simply have been incomplete. And sometimes an incomplete truth can mislead more effectively than an obvious lie because it still contains enough reality to feel believable. That was the deeper exposure. The third party may not have needed to invent a dramatic story. They may only have emphasized one part while leaving out another. Your soulmate began to recognize that possibility, and it changed how they remembered everything afterward. They remembered becoming distant because they thought you had already emotionally stepped away. But what if you had only been asking for time? They remembered deciding not to express something important because they assumed you would not receive it. But what if you had actually been waiting for reassurance? They remembered telling themselves to move forward because they believed that was what you wanted. But what if neither of you truly wanted that distance at all? Those questions did not give your soulmate instant answers, but they created something they had not felt in a long time: openness. And openness can be the beginning of repair, even before a single word is spoken. Your soulmate no longer needed the past to be simple. They simply wanted it to be honest. Then came one of the quietest yet strongest realizations of all. Your soulmate understood that the third party had only been able to influence the connection because there had been an empty space where communication should have been. That insight did not excuse the interference, but it gave your soulmate something useful to carry forward. If something meaningful ever grows again between you, they do not want silence to become a place where other people's assumptions can live. They want difficult questions asked gently. They want concerns spoken before they become stories. They want both of you to have the dignity of being understood directly. And perhaps that is why this exposure is changing them more than they expected. It is not simply revealing another person's behavior, it is revealing what your soulmate values now. Clarity. Directness. Patience. Emotional courage. Things they may not have understood deeply enough before. Something inside them is becoming less interested in being right and more interested in being real. And then, unexpectedly, your soulmate found themselves wondering about your side again. Not what they believed you felt. Not what someone else claimed you felt. Your actual experience. What did you think when the distance appeared? Did you sense that something had changed after that third party became involved? Did you ever wonder whether you had unknowingly done something wrong? Did you carry questions you eventually stopped asking because the answers never came? Your soulmate could not know. But for the first time, the uncertainty did not frighten them. It made them want to listen. That may be the most important change so far. They are no longer preparing a defense. They are preparing to understand. And yet there is still one more layer beneath all of this, because as your soulmate examined the timeline, they noticed something about the third party's behavior immediately after the misunderstanding. Instead of stepping back once your soulmate became distant from you, the third party became more involved. More available. More interested in discussing your connection. More eager to explain what your silence supposedly meant. And that pattern raised a question your soulmate had never allowed themselves to ask. What did the third party gain when the two of you stopped communicating clearly? They did not jump to an answer. They simply noticed the pattern. And that was enough. Because once a pattern becomes visible, every old conversation takes on new meaning. Your soulmate began remembering comments that once sounded supportive but now seemed strangely designed to keep the situation unresolved. Maybe you should wait. Maybe they don't care as much as you think. Maybe you should stop asking. Each statement had encouraged more distance, not more understanding. And suddenly your soulmate realized that nearly every piece of advice they received moved them farther away from speaking directly to you. That was the moment the truth became impossible to ignore. Whatever the third party's intention had been, their influence had not brought clarity. It had created separation. Your soulmate finally saw that. And seeing it changed something profound. They no longer needed to know every motive behind the third party's choices before deciding what mattered. They only needed to recognize what the outcome had been. Confusion where there should have been conversation. Assumptions where there should have been questions. Distance where there might have been understanding. And your soulmate quietly decided they did not want to repeat that pattern. But just as they reached that conclusion, another detail surfaced, one that connects directly to the moment the third party first became concerned about you. Apparently, shortly before everything changed, your soulmate had said something about you to this person. Something unexpectedly personal. Something that revealed how seriously they were beginning to think about the connection. At the time, your soulmate had forgotten the conversation almost immediately. The third party had not. And now your soulmate is beginning to remember exactly what they said that day. The words were simple, but they may explain why the interference became stronger afterward. Because what your soulmate admitted about you was far deeper than anyone around them had realized. The words came back to your soulmate slowly, almost like something returning from a room they had not entered in a long time. They remembered sitting with the third party during an ordinary conversation when your name came up, and without planning to reveal anything, they had said something unexpectedly honest. There's something different about this connection. I can't explain it, but I don't want to lose it. At the time, your soulmate had not considered those words important enough to remember. They were simply speaking from the heart for a few seconds, letting down the guard they usually kept around emotions that felt too meaningful to explain. But now, looking backward, they realized that the atmosphere around the third party began changing after that conversation. The questions became more frequent. The interpretations became more certain. The warnings became more personal. And for the first time, your soulmate wondered whether the interference had started not because something was wrong between you, but because someone else finally understood how deeply you mattered. Don't skip, because this realization did not immediately make your soulmate suspicious of everything. It made them careful. They knew there could be many reasons someone might react strongly to hearing that a close connection was becoming serious. Sometimes people become protective. Sometimes they fear change. Sometimes they believe they are helping when they are actually projecting their own experiences onto someone else's life. Your soulmate did not need to turn the third party into a villain to recognize that something had shifted. They only needed to compare what happened before that confession with what happened afterward. And the difference was difficult to ignore. Before your soulmate admitted how important you were becoming, the third party rarely questioned you. Afterward, almost every conversation seemed to contain a reason to slow down, doubt, reconsider, or step away. Your soulmate sat with that pattern for a long time. Then something even more personal surfaced. They remembered how vulnerable they had felt after making that confession. Saying they did not want to lose you had forced them to acknowledge something they had been trying to keep manageable. This was no longer a casual connection they could easily explain away. You had become part of their emotional world. Your presence had begun influencing the way they imagined the future, the way they understood companionship, even the way they thought about what it means to feel safe around another person. They had not told you all of that. Perhaps they barely understood it themselves. But the third party had heard enough to recognize that something important was happening. And then came the painful irony. The very person your soulmate trusted with that vulnerability later became one of the strongest voices encouraging distance. That did not automatically prove bad intention, but it forced your soulmate to ask a question they had avoided for too long. Had this person truly been helping them understand the connection, or had they been helping them fear it? That question changed the emotional temperature completely. Your soulmate began remembering the advice they received after expressing something positive about you. Whenever they mentioned that you had been kind, the third party seemed to find a reason not to read too much into it. Whenever your soulmate said they missed you, the response often redirected them toward doubt. Whenever they considered reaching out, another concern somehow appeared. Looking back, your soulmate noticed that reassurance was rarely encouraged. Curiosity was rarely encouraged. Direct conversation was almost never encouraged. Instead, the safest option always seemed to be distance. And eventually, distance became normal. Something important is waiting for you here, because your soulmate began realizing that they had confused emotional safety with emotional avoidance. They thought stepping away protected them from disappointment. But distance had not actually given them peace. It had given them unanswered questions. The more they tried not to care, the more they wondered. The more they tried to accept someone else's explanation of you, the more their own memories resisted it. Somewhere underneath everything, a quiet part of them had never completely agreed with the story they were being told. That was why your name could still shift their mood. That was why certain memories stayed unusually vivid. That was why hearing someone speak unfairly about you never felt completely comfortable, even when your soulmate said nothing. Their own experience had been quietly contradicting the outside narrative all along. And now, for the first time, they were willing to listen to that contradiction instead of suppressing it. Then they remembered a particular evening when they almost reached out to you. They had your conversation open. They had typed something simple, nothing dramatic, perhaps just a question or a small attempt to reconnect. Their finger hovered over the screen, but they hesitated. Earlier that day, the third party had reminded them of the old statement supposedly made by you, the one that suggested you did not see the connection the same way. Your soulmate deleted the message. They told themselves they were respecting your wishes. They believed silence was the mature choice. Now, knowing that the statement itself may have been incomplete or misunderstood, that memory carried a different meaning. They had not stepped back because you asked them to. They had stepped back because they believed someone else's interpretation of what you wanted. Your soulmate closed their eyes when that realization arrived. Not because they wanted to punish themselves for the past, but because suddenly they understood how much can change when people fail to speak directly. One unsent message. One conversation avoided. One assumption left unchallenged. Tiny moments can become turning points without anyone noticing them at the time. Stay till the end, because this is where something inside your soulmate began moving from reflection toward intention. For the first time, they asked themselves what they would do differently if another opportunity for honest communication appeared. Their answer surprised them with its simplicity. They would stop trying to predict your response before giving you the chance to have one. They would not approach you with a speech prepared from old assumptions. They would not arrive demanding explanations for things you may never have known were happening. They would begin gently. They would ask. They would listen. They would allow awkwardness if necessary. Because suddenly, awkward honesty seemed far safer than comfortable misunderstanding. That realization gave them a strange sense of relief. They did not need to solve the entire history in one moment. They did not need every detail about the third party's motives. They only needed to decide what kind of person they wanted to be if your paths opened toward each other again. And your soulmate knew the answer now. They wanted to be present. Clear. Courageous enough to say, I may have misunderstood something, and I want to hear your side. There was something deeply freeing about admitting that. For so long, they had been protecting an image of themselves as someone who had made the sensible decision. Now they understood that changing their mind after receiving new information was not weakness. It was growth. A mature heart does not cling to an old conclusion simply because admitting uncertainty feels uncomfortable. It adjusts when truth becomes clearer. And your soulmate was adjusting. Then another detail surfaced that brought the third party's role into sharper focus. Someone remembered that shortly after your soulmate confessed they did not want to lose you, the third party had asked an unusual question: what would happen to everything else if this became serious? At the time, your soulmate thought the question was practical. Now it sounded different. Everything else. What exactly had that meant? Their routines? Their friendships? Existing dynamics? The amount of attention available to other people? Your soulmate did not assume the worst, but they finally understood that your connection represented change. And change can make even well-meaning people uneasy. Perhaps the third party had been less concerned about whether you were good for your soulmate and more concerned about what your closeness might change around them. That possibility softened something rather than hardening it. Your soulmate no longer needed to be angry to set a boundary. They could understand someone's insecurity without allowing that insecurity to determine their future. That was a powerful realization. Because boundaries built from clarity do not need hostility. Your soulmate could quietly decide that certain parts of their emotional life would no longer be open for constant outside interpretation. They could still value advice. They could still listen to people they trusted. But they would stop giving another person the final vote over a connection that person was not experiencing. This was the moment your soulmate truly began reclaiming their own perspective. And once they did, memories of you returned differently. They remembered not just dramatic moments, but ordinary ones. The way conversations with you could suddenly become deeper without warning. The way you notice details. The way a simple exchange sometimes stayed in their mind hours later. The way your presence seemed to create both comfort and nervousness because you mattered enough to make them care about being understood. They realized that some of what they had once labeled confusion may actually have been vulnerability. Caring deeply can feel confusing when someone is accustomed to keeping everything controlled. Perhaps the third party offered an escape from that vulnerability by giving them reasons to step back. If they could convince themselves there was something wrong with the connection, they would never have to face how much it mattered. That insight reached deeper than anything the third party had said. Your soulmate realized that outside influence only became powerful because part of them was already looking for permission to avoid emotional risk. And strangely, recognizing that did not make them ashamed. It made them more honest with themselves. The story was no longer simply, someone interfered. It became, someone interfered, and I allowed their certainty to replace a conversation I was afraid to have. That distinction gave your soulmate power again, because it meant they could choose differently now. Then your name appeared in another unexpected way. A song, a place, a phrase, perhaps something completely ordinary reminded them of a moment between you. But instead of pushing the memory away, your soulmate let it stay. They remembered how they felt around you before all the commentary began. That was the key. Before the questions. Before the warnings. Before anyone else began telling them what the connection meant. What had it felt like then? Their answer came almost immediately, simple. Not perfect. Not without uncertainty. But sincere. There had been curiosity without constant suspicion. Affection without analysis. A willingness to see where things might go. Your soulmate realized that the connection became complicated partly because too many people began trying to define it before the two people inside it had finished understanding it themselves. And perhaps that was what needed to change most. If there was ever another chapter, it could not be written by committee. It had to belong to the two people actually living it. That realization stayed with your soulmate through the rest of the day. They stopped replaying every third-party comment. They stopped searching for some dramatic explanation. Instead, they focused on one question: what truth had their own experience with you consistently shown? And surprisingly, the answer was not complicated. You had mattered. You still mattered enough that discovering these inconsistencies affected them. Whatever the future held, pretending otherwise was no longer useful. Then came a softer realization, one that almost brought a smile. Your soulmate remembered that there had been moments when you seemed to recognize their feelings before they could name them. Not because of anything mystical, but because you paid attention. You noticed when their tone changed. You sensed when they were holding something back. You could sometimes tell when a simple, "I'm fine," contained more than the word suggested. Your soulmate had once found that slightly intimidating. Now they understood why. Being genuinely seen can feel vulnerable. It removes some of the hiding places people use when they are uncertain about their own emotions. Perhaps that was another reason they listened so closely to outside voices. Those voices gave them explanations that felt easier than admitting you had reached somewhere emotionally significant. But now the simpler truth no longer frightened them as much. They cared. They had become afraid of losing something before they had fully allowed themselves to have it. And in trying to avoid that possibility, they may have helped create the very distance they feared. Something shifted in them when they understood this. Regret softened into responsibility. Responsibility softened into possibility. Instead of thinking, "I ruined everything," they thought, "If I ever get the chance, I can communicate differently." That was healthier. More grounded. More hopeful. And this is where the third party's exposure began producing an outcome nobody around them expected. Your soulmate stopped discussing you with that person. Not dramatically. Not as punishment. They simply became quieter about the connection. When questions were asked, they gave fewer details. When advice appeared without being requested, they listened politely but did not automatically absorb it. They were creating space inside themselves to hear their own thoughts again. And in that space, one truth kept returning: they wanted to know what actually happened from your perspective. Not because they expected every misunderstanding to disappear. Not because they had already decided what the future must become. They simply believed your voice deserved to be part of the story that had been built around you. That may sound obvious, but after so much indirect communication, it felt almost revolutionary. And then something happened that made this intention even stronger. Your soulmate discovered that the third party had recently referred to the old situation in a way that contradicted their original explanation. The difference was tiny, just one phrase, but it mattered. Originally, the third party had spoken as though they knew exactly what you meant. Now they described it as something they assumed you meant. Your soulmate caught the word immediately. Assumed. For a long moment, they said nothing. Then they asked one calm question: "So you didn't actually hear them say that?" The atmosphere changed. There was hesitation. A softer explanation followed. The third party said they had been trying to connect the dots. They thought they understood your behavior. They believed they were protecting your soulmate from disappointment. And there it was. Not a dramatic confession. Not some enormous secret. Something far more realistic and, in its own way, more revealing. The statement that had shaped months of uncertainty had been treated as direct knowledge when it had actually been an interpretation. Your soulmate felt almost weightless when they understood that. So much of the confusion had grown from certainty that was never truly certainty at all. They did not raise their voice. They did not need to. They simply said, "You should have told me you were guessing." And that sentence marked a boundary more powerful than any argument. The third party tried to explain that their intentions had been good, and perhaps they genuinely believed that. Your soulmate listened. But good intention did not change the lesson. From now on, assumptions would be labeled as assumptions. Opinions would remain opinions. And anything important involving you would need to be understood through direct conversation, not translated through another person. That was the real exposure. Not that every word had been deliberately false, but that interpretation had been presented with the weight of fact. Your soulmate finally saw the difference. And once they saw it, the entire story rearranged itself. The old statement lost its authority. The distance no longer seemed inevitable. Their decision to hold back no longer felt like proof that the connection had failed. It felt like a choice made with incomplete information. And choices made with incomplete information can be revisited when understanding changes. Your soulmate sat alone later that evening, thinking about that possibility. Not rushing toward a conclusion. Not imagining some perfect reunion. Simply acknowledging that perhaps a door they believed was permanently closed had never actually been locked. Maybe both of you had simply stopped reaching for the handle. And then their phone was suddenly in their hand. Your name was closer than it had been in a long time. They did not immediately send anything. They read an old exchange first. Then another. And something inside them became very quiet as they reached one message near the beginning of the distance, the message they had once interpreted as confirmation that you were pulling away. Reading it now, with everything they had learned, your soulmate noticed one line they had completely overlooked. A line that did not sound like goodbye at all. It sounded like someone waiting to be met halfway. And for the first time, your soulmate began wondering whether you had left that door open much longer than they ever realized.